26 red flag warnings, all at once, stretching from the Sierra Nevada to the Texas Panhandle in a single unbroken corridor. A third of the contiguous United States lit up on the same map, on the same Friday. The National Weather Service doesn't issue those warnings casually. Each one marks a zone where the combination of heat, low humidity, and wind has crossed a threshold. Not approached it, crossed it. Where any ignition has a realistic chance of becoming a disaster. One warning is serious. A cluster of 5 or 6 is a regional emergency. 26 simultaneous warnings spanning 6 states is something that doesn't have a clean historical comparison. And the thing that makes this genuinely hard to process, it is 6 weeks before fire season is supposed to begin. Not 6 days, not a week and a half, 6 weeks. The crews that fight large fires in the American West operate on a seasonal calendar. Equipment pre-positioned in late spring, staffing ramped up through June, mutual aid agreements activated in phases. None of that pipeline is open yet. The corridor itself runs roughly southwest to northeast. Sierra Nevada foothills, the Mojave Desert slopes, across the Sonoran and Chihuahuan deserts, up through the southern plains, terminating in the Texas Panhandle. It follows the fuel, grass and shrub that hasn't seen meaningful rain in months, sitting under a pressure system, pushing 70-mile-per-hour gusts in some zones, and dropping humidity to levels where wood stops behaving like wood and starts behaving like paper. 4% relative humidity in the Panhandle. That number will come back. It should. 4%. Let's stay there for a moment, because that number doesn't communicate its own meaning without context. Relative humidity in vegetation. The moisture content in the grasses and shrubs that actually carry a fire tracks with the air around it. When ambient humidity drops, fuels dry out. That relationship isn't linear. Below about 25%, fire behavior starts to shift noticeably. Below 15, it becomes aggressive. Below 10, you're in the range where suppression crews talk about fire making its own weather. 4% is not a threshold approached. 4% is a threshold the Texas Panhandle drove through and kept going. Now the wind. 70 miles per hour on the Mojave Desert slopes isn't a gust in the way most people picture a gust. A brief spike, then calm. These are sustained event winds, the kind that hold for hours. Wind does 2 things to fire that matter most. It desiccates fuel faster than the air temperature alone would, and it carries embers. At 70 miles per hour, burning material can travel a mile ahead of the fire front. A mile. That's called spotting, and it's what turns a manageable perimeter into 5 simultaneous perimeters before a crew can reposition. And then there's the fuel load itself. 90th percentile dryness for the date means the grasses and shrubs in this corridor are drier than 90% of all recorded measurements taken at this same point in the calendar year. Not unusually dry. Not concerning. Drier than nearly every comparable moment in the historical record. 3 metrics. Each one on its own would put a fire weather forecaster on alert. All 3, at the same time, across a corridor a third of the country wide. That's not a bad day on the fire weather calendar. That's the calendar itself sending a signal. The calendar is sending a signal, but what exactly is it saying? Because the phrase early fire season gets used loosely, as though the season just shuffled forward a few days, the way a late frost might push back the first flowers. That's not what's happening here. Fire season in the American West was historically defined by a cluster of conditions that converged in late summer. Winter snowpack gone, summer rains not yet arrived. Months of accumulated heat drawing moisture out of fuels. In most of the region, that window opened somewhere between mid-June and early July. It was narrow. It was predictable. Agencies planned around it, budgeted around it, staffed around it. What's active right now is late March into early April. That's not early by days. That's early by 6 to 8 weeks. And 6 weeks isn't a scheduling inconvenience. It's an entirely different atmospheric regime. The storms that were supposed to keep humidity up through spring haven't materialized the way they once reliably did. The fuels that were supposed to still be carrying winter moisture are instead sitting at 90th percentile dryness. The gap between safe and critical used to have a buffer. The buffer is gone. And here's the deeper problem. This isn't the first year the calendar has slipped. Researchers tracking fire season length across the western United States have documented a consistent pattern. The season starting earlier, ending later, with the extreme risk window widening from both ends. What was once a 6-week peak is stretching towards 6 months in some regions. So when forecasters say the season started too early, they're not describing an anomaly anymore. They're describing a trend that has now arrived far enough ahead of the infrastructure built to handle it that the gap itself has become the hazard. That gap between the infrastructure and the conditions is where ignition lives. And right now, the ignition threshold is almost nothing. In a normal month, a downed power line is a repair call. A dragged trailer chain throwing sparks on a highway shoulder is a near miss that nobody notices. A cigarette flicked from a window, a lawnmower blade striking rock, a controlled burn that escapes its boundary by 20 feet. These are the routine friction of a landscape that can absorb them. The fuel load is moderate, the humidity keeps combustion in check, and any small fire that starts tends to stay small. None of that is true right now. At 4% humidity, dead grass ignites like paper. At 70 miles per hour, a flame front can move faster than a person can run. And fuels at the 90th percentile dryness aren't just dry, they're primed. The moisture threshold that slows fire spread is called the fire danger threshold, and right now the corridor isn't approaching it. It crossed it days ago. What this means in practice is that the spark gap has collapsed. That's the term fire behavior analysts use for the distance, in energy, in time, in conditions, between an ignition source and a catastrophic fire. In a high humidity spring month, the gap is wide. An ignition that would normally fizzle can't sustain itself long enough to grow. Right now, that gap is measured in seconds. The sources haven't changed. Power lines still sag in wind. Vehicles still pull over on dry roadsides. People still make small mistakes. What changed is everything underneath. The fuel, the moisture, the air. The same spark that goes nowhere in April becomes the thing that takes a county before sunset in a corridor this ready. A county before sunset. That's the operational problem. Because the system's built to stop that from happening. The crews, the equipment, the power infrastructure threading through that corridor. They were built around a different calendar. Start with the power lines. Across the Southwest and into the Texas Panhandle, transmission corridors run directly through the fire weather corridor. In high wind events, lines slap together, insulators fail, conductors contact dry vegetation. California's deadliest fires in modern history, Camp, Dixie, Zog, had utility equipment in the ignition report. The utilities know this. They have weather-triggered shutoff protocols. But those protocols carry their own cost, rolling outages in communities that are already stressed, hospitals on backup power, water treatment plants that need electricity to keep pressure in the lines that fight fires. The mitigation and the vulnerability are the same infrastructure. Then there are the crews. Wildland firefighting runs on a seasonal hiring cycle that mirrors the old fire season, which means right now, in late winter heading into early spring, many hand crews are not yet at full strength. Hotshot crews are training. Seasonal hires are still in onboarding. The interagency coordination centers that dispatch aircraft and engines operate on readiness levels tied to historical risk windows. And those windows haven't officially elevated yet. Pre-positioned equipment is the other gap. Air tankers, single-engine air tankers, helicopters under exclusive use contracts. They get placed at forward bases as risk builds. That positioning takes days to shift. Right now the corridor is live, but the full deployment posture that would match it hasn't been ordered, because the date says it shouldn't need to be. And the communities sitting inside that corridor, many of them in the Panhandle, the Eastern Sierra foothills, the Mojave Interface, they aren't on pre-evacuation notice. The warnings are posted. But warnings and readiness are different things, and the gap between them is exactly where fires find their window. That window doesn't stay the same size. It grows. And the way it grows is the part that doesn't get explained often enough. Fire weather doesn't stack additively. It compounds. Each factor amplifies the next in a chain. And once the chain is running, the math accelerates faster than most people expect. Start with humidity. At 4%, the fine fuels, grass, dried brush, the loose litter on the surface, are at moisture levels where they ignite almost on contact with a heat source. But the low humidity isn't just a fuel problem. It's a wind problem too. Dry air has lower density. Lower density air accelerates more easily across terrain, hits higher speeds with the same pressure gradient. And, critically, it doesn't slow a fire's convection column the way humid air does. The column rises faster. Faster column, stronger inflow winds at the fire's base. The fire is essentially generating its own wind now. That self-generated wind does something specific. It throws embers. Spotting, when burning material gets lofted ahead of the fire front, is the mechanism that turns a manageable fire line into an uncontainable event. In normal fire weather, spotting distances run a few hundred yards. At 70-mile-per-hour gusts with a supercharged convection column, spotting can carry embers more than a mile, sometimes several miles. Each ember is a new ignition point, the head of the line, outside the containment perimeter. Crews aren't fighting one fire anymore. They're fighting dozens. And the corridor itself? It isn't static. The high-pressure ridge driving these conditions is still shifting east. The same desiccating airflow that's already over the Panhandle and the Mojave will track into areas that were marginal yesterday and critical today. The edge of the corridor is a moving boundary, and it's moving into terrain that hasn't been prepped, toward communities that aren't yet watching it. So the question isn't whether conditions are bad right now. They are. The question is what the forecast window looks like, and whether there's a single threshold left that hasn't already been crossed. Here's what the forecast window shows, and it isn't a reprieve. The ridge holds through the weekend. Humidity in the Panhandle stays below 6% for at least 72 hours. The gusts don't moderate before Tuesday at the earliest, and when they do, it's a brief soft spot, not a break. Not the kind of atmospheric exhale that lets crews get ahead of anything already burning. Forecasters are watching 3 specific signals. First, overnight recovery. Humidity is supposed to climb back at night. Right now in the corridor, it isn't climbing enough. The air is so dry that even the overnight rebound leaves fuels below critical thresholds by dawn. No recovery means no reset. Every day starts worse than the last. Second, the moisture return from the Gulf. There's a window in the medium-range models where Gulf flow pushes north and interrupts the desiccating air. It's there. It's uncertain. And it arrives, at earliest, after the most dangerous stretch has already run. Third, and this is the one that changes the character of the situation, the Panhandle. 4% humidity isn't a warning level reading. It's a threshold that fire behavior analysts use to mark the point where suppression tactics stop working as designed, where aerial retardant evaporates before it grounds, where handline construction can't keep pace with spread rate. At 4%, you're not trying to put it out anymore. You're trying to decide what you're willing to lose. That's not a forecast for what might happen under the wrong conditions. The conditions are already there. The question the next 72 hours answers isn't whether this corridor can produce a siege-level fire event. It's whether it does before the wind relents, and the wind isn't relenting yet. Here's the thing about a siege-level event happening in early spring. It used to be the exception that proved the rule. The rule was that fire season had edges, a beginning and end, months in between where the West could exhale, restock, rebuild. That rule is gone. The data on this isn't subtle. In the 1970s and 1980s, the average fire season in the American West ran about 5 months. By the 2010s, it had stretched past 7. Today, fire behavior analysts at agencies across the region have largely stopped using the phrase fire season internally. Not because they're being dramatic, but because a season implies an off-season, and the off-season has functionally collapsed. What's happening right now across that 6-state corridor isn't early. That framing is already wrong. Early means you're ahead of schedule on a schedule that still exists. What the fuels data and the humidity readings and the wind forecasts are describing is a place where the schedule itself has been rewritten, where the conditions that used to define peak fire danger in July now arrive in March and stay. The corridor that ignited 26 red flag warnings simultaneously isn't an anomaly that will snap back to baseline. The baseline moved. The 90th percentile fuel dryness for the date is 90th percentile against a historical record that was already warming, meaning the comparison is generous. The new normal is drier than the old worst case. So when the wind finally relents in the Panhandle, when the warnings drop and the immediate danger passes, the temptation will be to mark it resolved, to file it. But the conditions that built this corridor, the depleted soil moisture, the earlier green up followed by earlier die-off, the compression of wet season into a narrower window, those don't resolve with a weather system. They're structural. 26 warnings, 6 states, a third of the country, in March. The question was never whether this was a bad week for fire weather. The question is what we call a place where nearly every week has the potential to be.